It's always such a joy to be with League members because, as you shared in that introduction, Mary, this is at the heart of what the League of Women Voters is all about, right? Making votes count, holding elected officials accountable. So you heard a little bit about my story and my background, which is to say, I worked in policy for about a decade prior to coming into this work in health policy specifically. I don't have any particular affinity for electoral systems or background in that more than the rest of us, in knowing that they're critical to representative democracy. But I come to this work from actually that public health perspective of, if you continue to go upstream from what the problem is, which is getting nothing done in Congress, you ultimately get back to this broken electoral system. And I was experiencing that in my day job of health policy work, there would be all these solutions that elected officials would tell you behind closed doors on both sides of the aisle that totally makes sense, right? That is the right policy. It's absolutely going to move the ball forward, but sorry, we can't get it done because politics is going to get in the way. And I was also at the time, before coming to this work, on the city council in Madison, where I live, and working on the political side. So had a background in politics. And I grew up in a political household, right? We were one of those houses where you're dropping lit at doors when you're 6 years old with your mom. That's just how I grew up. And so politics was to some degree in my blood, but it was also infuriating because it was the problem, it was not supporting the policy work that I knew made so much sense from my day job. And so there was this frustration and tension that I was feeling in both of these worlds that I was simultaneously living in. And all of a sudden, this work came to me from business leader, Wisconsinite Catherine Gale. And when I first read her work, highlighted in the politics industry, it was like a light bulb was going off for me that so well explained the gridlock that I was experiencing on the policy side and the dysfunctional politics that I was experiencing on the political side, and why they were working together to create this zero-sum game that we were experiencing. And so I won't go into, right, this is a whole book. I'm not going to go into everything today except to recommend it to you and tell you you've got some teasers of information on the table, extra stuff that you can please take home with you. But I'll give you a brief summary of Catherine's thesis, the background and analysis that's written up in the politics industry, and then most importantly, what it calls us to do to change the system. So the light bulb moment for Catherine Gale, who at the time I was telling Mary this earlier, at the time that she had the light bulb moment, she was CEO of Gale Foods in Germantown. She was doing a competition strategy for her business, and she was thinking about how better to sell cheese sauce. And she had also been involved in politics, right? You don't really think of those things going together, cheese sauce and politics, but she had personally been involved in politics. And as she was doing the analysis, she thought, well, what if I applied these same tools that are standardly used in business analysis, Porter's 5 Forces, Harvard Business School theory, to politics as an industry? Because ultimately, politics is an industry, the industry of politics, not government, but the consultants, the money, all of the things that go into the politics industry. And ultimately, what she found in running this parallel analysis is that the politics industry is a protected duopoly. So what that means is that it's this industry with only 2 players and very high barriers to entry for new competition. And in any industry, a protected duopoly ultimately means that customers have basically no power because they only have 2 choices. And those 2 industry players often collude and work together to create high barriers to entry so no new competition comes into the industry, and that ultimately doesn't serve us, the public, the customers, very well in any for-profit industry, but also in our politics industry. So to say it in another way, you can think about it as the fact that in any other industry as big and as thriving with as much money as politics and a 90% customer dissatisfaction rate, right? Congress's approval rating hardly is ever above 10 or 12%. With only 2 companies, some entrepreneur would come into that industry because they'd see this huge customer dissatisfaction and see that as a business opportunity to bring in new competition and respond to customers' want and ultimately profit. But that doesn't happen in politics because our politics is, as I described, this uniquely anti-competitive industry with unhealthy competition. So no matter how many times we might say it, we say politics is broken all the time, right? But ultimately, politics is doing what it's designed to do, just like any other industry. Because in any human endeavor, the rules of the game impact the way the game is played. And it's no different in politics. In fact, the rules in politics that are causing us most of the dissatisfaction that we see are ones we don't often think about. Maybe you all do, I do, because we're a bit political nerds, but most people don't, right? So as many times as we want to pretend that some change candidate is going to come in and surmount those barriers to entry and save us all from the dissatisfaction, we're left dissatisfied because nothing really changes, right? Because it's a design problem, it's a systems problem, and it needs to be addressed as such. So the key design flaw can be shown in this Venn diagram as a nice illustration. Now you'll see that there's no intersection in this Venn diagram, which is kind of the problem, right? Because in our current system, there's virtually no intersection between Congress solving problems, acting in the public interest and doing what we need them to do, and the likelihood that they will get reelected. So there's one rule that is fundamentally problematic that, again, most people don't think about, but maybe you all do more than most, which is the design of our party primaries. And we should take some responsibility for that because, as you all might remember, Wisconsin in the progressive era, we created the primary system that we have today. So it's also, I like to say, incumbent on us to update it over time. We updated it in the early 1900s, we better update it again today. Because right now, it's the only election that matters. For most of our House and Senate races for U.S. Congress, whoever wins is decided in the party primary. And that's over 80% of our congressional elections. In a safe red district, a Republican is going to win, right? Whoever makes it through that Republican primary in August is going to win in November. November doesn't matter. In a safe blue district, whoever makes it through the Democratic primary is going to win. November doesn't matter. And most general elections have no impact. But again, as you all know, the problem is only about 10% of voters are effectively deciding those elections. Turnout, even here in Wisconsin, which is a fairly high turnout state for party primaries, is around about 20% for these party primaries most of the time. It's dismally low. And these 10% of the electorate on either side who are determinative in these party primaries are more politically extreme than most voters as a whole, than the general electorate. So that means that those voters are actually more extreme than most of the voters within their own party as well, right? They are a small segment of the electorate that's ultimately the boss of all of us and all of our elected officials because they are who determines who gets elected. And it's interesting because you might think that there's basically nothing that 10% on the right and 10% on the left have in common. They couldn't be more different. But actually there's one way that they are very similar. And that is the fact that over and above anything else, they want their side to win. They don't want compromise. They don't want consensus-oriented solutions or problem solving. They want, right, perfect. We always say perfect is the enemy of the good. No. They want perfect. It's called negative partisanship. There's a lot of political theory around this problem of negative partisanship between these two extremes. So step back for a moment and just play a thought experiment with me and imagine that you are a member of Congress and you are trying to govern. You're looking at some bipartisan solution to one of our country's biggest problems. Pick whatever issue you care about, whether it be immigration, healthcare, the economy. And think about the questions that you maybe should ask yourself when looking at that piece of legislation. Hopefully, as a representative, you're asking yourself if this is good policy. Is this going to do what it says it's going to do? Or you're asking yourself, is this the best possible solution, or is there something better that we could be doing? Or even just asking yourself, is this what my constituents would want me to vote for? I'm a representative. Do my constituents like this policy? But ultimately, there's one question over and above any of those questions that you have to ask yourself when looking at a piece of policy in Congress right now. And that is the question of, will I make it back through my party primary if I vote for this? And if the answer to that question is no, which it virtually always is on consensus-oriented, complex solutions to our nation's biggest problems, then that design means that you're going to vote no on that common sense, consensus-oriented solution, right? Because in order to keep doing your job, you have to make it back through your party primary. It's totally rational that that's the decision that you have to make as a member of Congress. So if you just, because, right, we all know that if you decide to vote yes on that consensus-oriented solution, you're going to be at least threatened with, or maybe even have, a party primary waged against you. Because again, as you all know, primary isn't just a noun anymore, it's also a verb. As in, step out of line and we're going to primary you, right? So party primaries are really at the root of the dysfunction that we see in governing in Congress, because they are the reason that neither side can deal powerfully in the complex trade-offs that are actually necessary for problem solving and policy making. They forbid those two sides from working together and coming up with common sense consensus solutions, because that sort of problem solving doesn't win party primaries. So let's take another look at this Venn diagram again, right? Which is to say a little bit more plainly now that if our elected representatives do their jobs in the way that we need them to, they're likely to lose those jobs. So that's just fundamentally bad design and pretty crazy. And here's what else is crazy. As we mentioned earlier, politics is one of the only industries where we as voters are regularly told that less competition is somehow better for us, right? We go to the grocery store and we see all of our cereal options, and that's fabulous because that's better for us because competition makes that cereal better and brings prices down. All the things that competition does in any industry. In politics, when new competition tries to get in, we're told, oh, no, don't get in, right? More competition is ultimately going to be bad for us. And so there's no accountability for elected officials not doing what we want them to do, because they don't need us to like what they're doing. They just need us to choose between one of them as, frankly, the lesser of two evils. Or, as many people do, just stay at home and say, my vote doesn't matter anyway. Why would I even try? Why would I even go vote? So let me be clear and say that there's nothing inherently wrong with extreme views. And frankly, innovation often comes from the fringes, from the edges. That's not our problem. Our problem is that those voices have outsized power in our current political system. So our problem is also not the Democrats or the Republicans either. In fact, there's a lot of literature, and I personally find it compelling, that parties are actually really necessary and valuable in a political system, that we actually need stronger parties than we have today. The problem, as we define it at Democracy Found, and as I believe myself, is that we only have two major parties. And even if we only have two going forward, the problem is that they're virtually guaranteed to remain the only two. There's no competitive pressure to get them to respond and act according to the broader general interest. So the benefit is that we can fix both of those problems. We can fix the problem of the party primary, and we can fix the problem of no competition in the general election by this political innovation, as we call it, Final Five voting. Because Final Five voting goes right at that design flaw. It goes right at the incentives that are driving behavior in Washington, D.C. Unlike sometimes the terms get thrown around political reforms, Final Five voting is not a Trojan horse for either side. it's not going to, by design or by impact, benefit one side or the other, which is really powerful because it's not necessarily designed to change who wins. It's not. It's designed to change the incentives for whomever wins to be accountable to their general electorate. So I'd like to be very clear on this, right? In a red district, a Republican can still win. In a blue district, a Democrat is probably still going to win. But ultimately, those winners are going to be accountable to their general electorate with Final Five voting. So let's go through Final Five voting, which is to say 2 changes. The first is in the primary. So instead of having to go in and do, as we designed in Wisconsin, the progressive era, pick your ballot, right? You can only vote in the Democratic column or the Republican column. There's just one column for each race with all of the different candidates and their party affiliations, and you pick your favorite. So in this particular race, I like the Green Bay party apparently, and I'm going to pick the Packers. They'll be my favorite. And the top 5 vote getters, regardless of party affiliation, advance to the general election. So the primary is simply serving in many ways as a narrowing mechanism to make sure you get to a broadly representative segment of the electorate of 5 choices into the general election. So now, in that general election, we have 5 candidates, and we, as voters, can benefit from dynamic and healthy competition of ideas, of different visions, of candidate credentials. In that general election, we have real choice as voters between candidates, not just plug your nose and pick one side or the other, right? So in the general, with 5 candidates now, we have to figure out who's going to win. And it's not as simple as you might think, because having 5 candidates is really great because it gives us this benefit of healthy competition. But it also could be really screwed up if we allowed for the winner to be the person who just got 21, right? Got the most number of votes without getting a true majority. Because with 5 candidates, if you split the vote and said the person with 21% wins, that doesn't feel right, right? 79% of the electorate being unhappy. So we use a tool called instant runoff voting with a ranked choice ballot on the general election. So here's how that looks. Oh, my slides are a little bit messed up. But in that, right, competition, those 5 choices from our primary ballot make it onto the general election ballot. And I can go in and I can say, I liked the Packers, right? And I can stop there. I can just vote for the Packers if I want to in the general election and submit my ballot, and my ballot counts just like it does today. But I can also tell you that if I can't have the Packers, I also like the Bucks, kind of like the Brewers. I don't really like the Forward, and I definitely don't like the Admirals. So I can rank as many or as few choices as I want to signify my preferences. And what this allows for is it allows for once all the votes are in, right? You count all the first place votes first. And if someone gets over 50%, the election's over and they win, right? They had majority support. But if no one had over 50% in that general election, that's where the instant runoff comes into place. It's just like a traditional runoff, except remember, we already cast all of our votes, so you can just automatically drop the candidate who came in last, and anyone who voted for them has the opportunity to have their single vote transferred to the candidate that they ranked second. And that process of elimination and single vote transfer continues until someone has over 50% support, demonstrating that they are actually the candidate who the broadest segment of the electorate supports, or at least is okay with, right? That creates that consensus-oriented candidacy. And so, most importantly, if we're thinking about that competition angle and lens on this, this system removes the barriers to entry for new competition, because there's no more spoiler or wasted vote problems, right? Think back to the Ross Perot example that made the spoiler problem so famous to so many. Now, if you want to vote for Ross Perot, you can, but you can also have your second choice count. So you can signify that you really care about something. So the Perot example is perfect because, right, he was all about debt deficit issues. And everybody told him when he was running that no one cared about deficits, right? And then actually 19% of the electorate threw their vote away for president on a candidate who was running on that platform. And then both major parties after that in the early 90s it was to their benefit to try to capture that 19% of the electorate. So they had incentive to respond accordingly to these issues around fiscal policy in a way that they wouldn't have without that competitive pressure of someone like Ross Perot showing that that's an issue. And in a system like this, candidates can get in on these ideas, platforms, and people can vote for them without fear of wasting their vote. So all of a sudden, that dynamic competition really starts working for us, the voters in this system. So no more spoiler problem, no more wasted votes. So let's summarize the solution, right? Final five voting is very specifically the opening up to a single ballot top five primary and an instant runoff general election. It's those two things together. And it's not necessarily designed to change who wins. It's designed to focus on those incentives of what the winners have the freedom to do once they are elected. So think back to our thought experiment, right? We're members of Congress again, and we're looking at that bipartisan solution to whatever you chose as your issue that you cared about. And we can now look at that issue a little bit differently because we're not so worried about being primaried on it anymore, right? The primary is not a threat because it's a top five primary. If you are an incumbent and you are doing your job well and your constituents generally like you, let's hope you're going to make it into the top five. If not, maybe you got other problems to deal with, right? And if you do, then in the general election, even if you took what's sometimes called a tough vote right now in our current system, you can take those tough votes and maybe you won't be everybody's first choice, but you will likely or have the opportunity to win by having people give you their first, second, maybe even third place vote. You can create this coalition of support to make sure that you are still broadly representing your electorate. But your electorate, this is the key, right? Your electorate is your general electorate, not your primary electorate like it is right now. So that changes the freedom that these legislators have when dealing with these complex trade-offs that we need them and we elect them to deal with, right? That's what they're supposed to do. So if we go back to our original Venn diagram, we can maybe look at it a little differently right now, right? Which is to say that under a Final Five system, politicians are actually incentivized to solve problems. And they're freed up from this, sometimes we call it, sounds a little extreme, but tyranny of the party primary. They have freedom to innovate, to lead, to think independently, to reach across the aisle when it's helpful to do so to solve problems, and to deliver solutions for their constituents. So rather than just grandstanding and sitting in political gridlock, they have some incentive to deliver solutions. And if they don't deliver solutions, then that's where competition comes in, right? Because a new competitor can get in and hold them accountable and offer a different alternative to us, the voters, the electorate, who will do the things that we want them to do. Sometimes Catherine Gale, the co-chair of my board, calls this dynamic free market politics because there's something about it that is really just delivering what the best of healthy competition in free markets is supposed to deliver in any industry, which is innovation, results, and accountability. So hopefully that sounds pretty good to you all. It sounds pretty good to me, but you might be looking at me and thinking, okay, Sarah, but that's never going to happen, right? Dream on. We're never going to get something like Final Five voting. So let me just tell you that Final Five voting is not only powerful, because clearly we've talked about that, but it's also achievable. And it's achievable because we are starting to have some proof. So in 2017, that report that I left a couple copies of on the table, feel free to take them, Catherine Gale's early work on politics industry theory was published through Harvard Business School, and it made it all the way up to Alaska, where a person named Scott Kendall, who I have the privilege of working with now, read this report. And then he used it to take action. He designed a ballot initiative in Alaska with this combination of a single ballot primary and an instant runoff general election and the Alaska voters passed it in 2020. They will use it for the first time this year in 2022 for their special election for their House of Representatives seat. Funny anecdote here. You might not be super familiar with Alaska politics, but everybody is kind of more familiar these days because we're all watching Lisa Murkowski, right? One of the few senators who actually matters. So Alaska is interesting because they have a very independent streak, and they have one congressman for all of Alaska, and he's been congressman for 50 years, longest serving member of Congress. So he passed away, unfortunately, in March, and now they've got this open seat that they need to fill, and there are 48 candidates running for that open seat in Alaska. Imagine, 48 candidates. So thank goodness they have this electoral system, because it's fascinating, actually. So those 48 candidates, I'm going a little tangent here, but I think you all find it interesting because you're political nerds like I am. So those 48 candidates actually mirror the political identity and makeup of Alaska. So approximately the same number of Republicans, independents, and Democrats are in that race as those who are registered in Alaska. So it's very representative. It will narrow down to Alaska's doing the top 4. We're proposing top 5, but very similar, right? But they'll have 4 choices in that general election, and the general electorate will pick their congressman for hopefully maybe not the next 50 years, but for however long that congressman is still accountable to their voters and stays in Congress. So the other little tangent I'll bring up is that sometimes I talk to people about this solution of Final 5 voting, and they ask, well, why not term limits, right? Term limits is something it's always popular with the electorate as a whole when you ask them about it. Now, if you're a political science nerd, you know that there's some downsides to term limits as well, but there's something inherently and potentially term limiting about a system of Final 5 voting, which is that ultimately we are supposed to be the ones who can term limit our representatives if they're not doing their jobs, right? The electoral system is supposed to be that accountability, but it's not acting as that right now. So people go to, well, maybe we should just put artificial term limits in because we got to cycle these people through. Somehow we don't want everyone to be there for 50 years, but if we had an accountable electoral system, maybe that's less needed, right? So anyway, I diverged for a while, but I diverged to say that ultimately this solution is achievable because Article 1 of the Constitution delegates all powers to how we run elections to states. So in a federalist system, we have different electoral methods in every single state already. We often don't think about this, but we actually saw it playing out far more in 2020, right? People all of a sudden became familiar with runoffs because Georgia had runoffs, and they were nationally kind of discussed. And that's the case, right? California has a top 2 system. Washington State has a top 2 system. Maine has ranked choice voting only. So there's this experimentation that can happen state to state to help us create accountabilities and ultimately electoral systems that work. So ultimately, our goal nationally is to pass Final 5 voting in 5 states by 2024. Now, that might not sound like a lot. Maybe it does sound like a lot to you all, but here's the power in that. If 5 states elected their U.S. senators differently, you would have 10 senators who are freed up to act differently, right? We hear all the time about the Gang of 6, the Gang of 8, these kind of fulcrums of problem-solving senators who come together to operate in this trade-off world of policymaking and are ultimately enough to move us by that 60-vote threshold to get things done in the Senate. So if you had 10 senators who had this electoral system that gave them wider freedom to govern, we would much more powerfully be able to solve problems in the U.S. Senate as soon as 2024. So we in Wisconsin have our work to do to be part of that 2024 solution, which is to say in 2018, our work here in Wisconsin started, which is Catherine Gale, who's our co-chair, shopped around her original report to one of her colleagues, Austin Ramirez, a CEO at Husco in Waukesha, and Austin said to Catherine, well, Catherine, this is really great theory, but ultimately we live in Wisconsin. Let's get this done in our state, right, in our home. where we could make a difference. And they came together and brought together people on both sides of the aisle who aren't traditionally in politics. These are mostly business leaders from all across Wisconsin who have different political preferences in terms of candidates or policy solutions, but have said, it's not working for any of us that our political system is this dysfunctional. It's actually creating a really unhealthy dynamic for competition, even internationally in the United States, and it's providing an economic risk to our businesses. So if we don't get involved in this sort of solution to solve it, what's going to happen? So they came together and then ultimately brought on board a handful of state senators and state representatives, again, from both sides of the aisle, who also thought this was a pretty good idea to move on Final Five voting here in Wisconsin. So this past legislative session, legislation was introduced for Final Five voting for federal elections in Wisconsin by a bipartisan group of co-authors, a Republican and a Democrat in the Senate, a Republican and a Democrat in the Assembly. We had a hearing in the State Senate Elections Committee. And as you all probably know, that is not an insignificant feat to have had bipartisan elections policy have a hearing in Wisconsin state legislature this past session. Went super well, 73 people testifying in support, 0 in opposition. And really good headlines in support, right? The State Journal has editorialized in support of Final Five voting. The La Crosse Tribune has editorialized in support. So the movement is growing, but it's still really a new concept. So honestly, my true ask for you all today is to get involved in such a way that you are talking about Final Five voting as a potential solution that is not partisan, and not talking about it just with political people, because this is something that powerfully, I think for so many people who have given up on politics, very rationally I will say, as they don't think it's ever going to change, something that sometimes piques their interest as something that could change and could actually change some of the results that they're so frustrated by. So I've been out giving presentations like this to Rotary clubs, local chambers, leagues, others really trying to focus on civic groups who are thought leaders in their communities, who can help us to spread the word about this particular policy solution that has the opportunity to make such a difference in our state and also all across our country. So go to our website to learn more, take some materials. Those are my remarks for today, but I would love to have some conversation with you all. So let's dive into questions and answers. And thank you so much for the opportunity to come and talk to you all today. I really appreciated it.